Warm greetings to each and every one of you. My name is Paul-André Durocher. I am the Archbishop of Gatineau, and this is the Mass Unconfined, a series of videos in which I present the various elements that make up the celebration of the Mass, the Eucharistic liturgy. This is episode 25. It's the second part that is devoted to the preparation of the gifts. In the last episode, I explained the structure and the meaning of the preparation of the gifts, the bringing up of the bread and the wine, and the presentation of this bread and wine, which will be transformed into the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. I want to speak in the next few minutes, about some of the secondary gestures that accompany and give meaning to this ritual. What's interesting about the celebration of the Eucharist, its history, is that it started out quite simply, very, very simply. At the beginning, as I explained in the last episode, the deacon would simply bring bread and wine, place them on the altar, and the priest would start the Eucharistic prayer. Over the centuries, prayers and gestures have been added to give more relief, you could say, greater prominence to the meaning of these gifts. And among these, the first I'd like to mention is the mixing of water and wine. When the wine is prepared, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but if a deacon is preparing it, he will pour the water, or if the priest himself is preparing, he will pour a bit of water into the wine. Well, this is a very natural custom in the Mediterranean. It still exists that when wine, we're used to very refined wines, but when wine is kind of homemade, it tends to be a bit stronger, a bit more potent, and so often the wine is cut with water to dilute it and make it more palatable, more pleasant to drink. And so it was quite normal to simply add wine. It was done in the time of Jesus. But somebody noticed that when this water is mixed with the wine, it connects to what's going on in the Eucharist. See, because in the Eucharist, Jesus is making himself present to us so that we might be joined to him, that we might be united to him. The wine is kind of the more precious element, the more tasty element, you could say, the special element. And so let's make that stand for the divinity. And the water is our common humanity. And as the water is added to the wine, the priest says these words: "By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity." So it speaks about what is going to happen in the Eucharist, this unity between our humanity and Christ's divinity. Another gesture, this happens at more solemn masses, is incense, incensing the altar and the people. So the incense is brought out as a sign of honor. Incense was burned in front of emperors and kings, and so it really is a sign of prestige and of honor. And so we honor these gifts of bread and wine by incensing them, and then we incense the altar, the table on which the bread and wine repose. They're laid there, because this becomes a sacred place where the bread and wine will become the body and blood of Christ. And then the people are incensed. The priest, the bishop, if I'm presiding, the priests who are celebrating, and then the whole people of God. Because again, it's this mystery of union. It's not just the bread and wine that become the body and blood of Christ. We are transformed also into his body. And so we become holy. The whole place, the whole church smells beautiful. Now, I realize some people are allergic to perfumes and react badly towards incense. But for those of us who don't, the smell of incense, particularly good incense, really gives a beautiful and sacred dimension to what is going on in the liturgy. And after having done this, the priest washes his hands. Now, again, there was a practical reason for this. When people brought up offerings in the past centuries, people didn't have money. What they brought was things from the earth. They would bring fruit, vegetables that had just been pulled out of the earth. And so the priest would receive these cords of wood. The priest would receive this. This is what was given. And so, yeah, his hands could have been dirty. And so he needed to wash them. And again, somebody noticed the deep connection between this very common, useful gesture and the meaning of what is happening here. As the priest is doing this, just before doing it, he prays, bowing before the altar, and he says, with humble spirit and contrite heart, may we be accepted by you, O Lord, and may our sacrifice in your sight this day be pleasing to you. So it's a sign of humility, recognizing that we come before God not being worthy of God's love. God's love is really a gift to each and every one of us, not something we deserve. And so we do this with humility. And again, as the priest washes his hand, he says a line from one of the Psalms, wash me, O Lord, from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Because none of us is worthy to actually be participating in the celebration of the Eucharist, much less presiding it. And so it's important at this time, before entering into the great Eucharistic prayer, that we take a moment to become aware of that fact and realize what it is, a great gift, what a great gift it is that God is giving us to be able to celebrate the Eucharist. Finally, at the end, once everything is ready, the priest turns to the people and says, pray, my brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours, this is a common sacrifice, the whole people's sacrifice. The priest will be leading this in a special way, and he will stand in the place of Christ as the head of his people, leading his people's prayers. And so in a special way, he really personifies Christ in the midst of the congregation. So his sacrifice, but it's the whole body's sacrifice. We are all the body of Christ. So my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father. And the people respond, may the sacrifice accept the sacrifice at your hands for the praise and glory of God's name, for our good and the good of all his holy church. And here again, you see, the Mass unconfined. This is not just for us. We're not saying for the praise and glory of his name and our good. We could say it. This will be good for me. At least we say our good, not just my good, but for our good. And the good of all his holy church, the church spread throughout the world, which is called to be the presence of God in the midst of the world, that is called to bring God's love to the world. So as we prepare to enter into the Eucharistic prayer, as we prepare to enter into the second great movement of this four-part movement, which is the Eucharistic liturgy, we ask God to make us aware that what we are doing is for the good of the whole church, and through the church for the whole world. One final gesture happens at this point. Once the people are standing, the priest says a short prayer over the gifts, basically kind of taking a moment to pause and asking God to make sure that what we're going to do right now truly is meaningful for each and every one of us who participate in this celebration. So we see how these little secondary gestures, a lot of these prayers are said sotto voce, they're said softly by the priest. They're not meant to be presidential prayers in the sense they're personal prayers of the priest, but we are aware of them. The whole community is aware of them, and they touch us and they speak to us. Others are said out loud, and they become the whole community's prayer. All of this is a movement. We've been taking up the bread and the wine as Jesus did the night before he died. And the second thing that Jesus did, do you remember? He gave thanks. And so now we are ready to enter into the great prayer of thanks, which we call the Eucharistic prayer. And we'll start with that in the next episode. We'll see you then.